Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into Paris. Not the sparkling city of lights you know, but a place locked in the grip of an unforgiving medieval winter. Picture the cobblestones slick with ice, chimneys puffing weakly against a sky that feels like stone, and the Seine itself stiff and silent under a thick crust of frost. You can almost hear the crackle of frozen branches, the shuffle of feet muffled in snow. It's a Paris that bites at your cheeks, steals your breath, and makes every simple act, from drawing water to finding food, an uphill battle against nature itself. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive more than a few hours out here. Forget cute Instagram hot chocolate. This is the kind of cold that makes you question every life choice that led to standing outdoors. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your current location and what time it is where you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the frozen city as dawn tries to drag itself across the horizon. The sky is a pale sheet, a kind of muted silver, and the streets are eerily quiet. Too quiet for Paris, which is usually buzzing with carts, hawkers, and gossip. Frost coats the wooden shutters of houses, every surface gleaming faintly as though dusted with ground glass. Even the bells of Notre Dame seem hesitant to toll, their chimes dulled by the heavy air. You huddle your cloak tighter. Not that it helps much. The wool scratches your skin and does a poor job of keeping out the icy breath that sneaks through every gap. The first thing you notice is how hard it is to move. The streets are treacherous, uneven stones made slick by packed snow, and you're walking like someone who's forgotten how knees work. Every step feels like a gamble, and every corner hides a patch of ice waiting to send you tumbling. If there were medieval YouTube fail compilations, you'd already be featured. And yet, this is the reality Parisians face every morning of winter. Even seasoned traders and milkmaids shuffle awkwardly, clutching their baskets and cursing under their breath as the city conspires to take them down. Your breath comes out in little clouds that drift upward, merging with the smoke of dozens of chimneys. But those thin curls of smoke aren't just picturesque. They tell you something about the city's struggle. Firewood is scarce. People ration logs like treasure, feeding the flames sparingly. The poorer families burn anything they can: broken furniture, damp straw, even scraps of old shoes if desperation runs deep enough. The richer households, of course, can afford great stacks of wood and glowing hearths. The inequality is visible in the very air. Faint smoke for the poor, thick plumes for the wealthy, and then comes the sound, the crunch of wagon wheels over frozen ground. A baker's cart lumbers by, creaking under the weight of bread. Instantly, a crowd gathers. Bread is not just food in medieval Paris, it's survival itself. The loaves are smaller in winter, the crusts darker, the flavor often bitter. Grain supplies are thin, prices soar, and bakers are forced to stretch what little they have. Sometimes the flour is mixed with ground beans, chestnuts, or even chalk, which sounds more like a TikTok challenge than a recipe. But hungry people don't complain too loudly. They just queue, coins clutched tight in gloved or bare hands, shivering in the hope that today, the baker won't run out before they reach the front. The air is filled with murmurs, stories of shortages, rumors of merchants hoarding grain, whispers that the king's officials should do more. Bread riots aren't unheard of in Paris, and in winters like this, they're practically expected. Imagine you're number 20 in line, and the baker suddenly announces there are only 10 loaves left. That's the medieval version of your favorite cafe saying they're out of oat milk. Except instead of minor disappointment, it could mean actual starvation. And amid the grumbling, you catch an odd little detail. Some families bring their own wooden stamps, pressing them into the dough before baking to mark the bread as theirs. It's not just practical, it's a safeguard against theft. If someone swipes your loaf later, you can point to the little flour cross, or even crude doodle of a goat burned into the crust and say, "That's mine." Picture medieval parents lecturing their kids, "Don't eat bread without checking the stamp." You never know whose goat you're eating. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but the fact that it existed at all tells you everything about how desperate times could get. You glance across the square at a cluster of ragged children. They're barefoot on the icy stones, hopping from one foot to another, their breaths puffing like little ghosts. They eye the bread cart with hollow intensity, waiting for the moment when a loaf might tumble, when a scrap might fall, when fortune might smile just long enough to give them something to chew. Some of them dart forward the moment a peace breaks off, fighting each other like sparrows. And here's where the humor of human resilience sneaks in. You see a kid manage to snatch half a crust, only to get chased down by a goose that apparently also wanted breakfast. Even in misery, there's absurd comedy. Not everyone is starving, though. You pass by the home of a wealthy merchant, and through the frosty window you glimpse silver dishes, steaming bowls, and servants bustling with trays. The contrast is staggering. Inside, laughter and warmth. Outside, muttered curses and chattering teeth. You feel the unfairness like a weight. But you also can't help but smirk at the irony. The rich man's tapestries are damp from the cold, and his supposedly cozy fire is belching smoke that makes the guests cough. Money buys comfort, sure, but not immunity from Parisian drafts. The day wears on, and the city reluctantly stirs into its winter rhythm. Blacksmiths bang half-heartedly on frozen anvils, their fingers stiff despite leather gloves. Vendors hawk salted meat, the only kind that won't spoil in the cold. Housewives carry buckets of frozen laundry, sheets stiff as wooden boards. Every sound feels muffled, every step heavier, as though the frost itself has seeped into everyone's bones. And just when you think you've had enough, you notice something beautiful. Along the edge of the Seine, where the ice catches the weak sunlight, children are sliding, shrieking with laughter as they turn misery into play. Their cheeks are red, their noses dripping, but their joy cuts through the gloom like a spark. Maybe that's the secret of winter survival. Not just bread and firewood, but the ability to laugh even when your toes are numb. Still, as night falls and you make your way through the shadowed streets, you can't shake the truth. This is only the beginning of winter. The cold will deepen, the hunger will sharpen, and the city will be tested again and again. And you, wrapped in your itchy cloak, feel the weight of it pressing down. The cold doesn't just nip at your nose anymore, it settles into your bones like an unwelcome roommate who refuses to leave. By the time you wander back toward the heart of the city, Paris is wearing its winter mask in full. The narrow streets are half buried in drifts of snow, and the roofs sag beneath heavy blankets that creak ominously, as though one more flake will bring the whole house down. Somewhere a dog howls, and the sound echoes through the alleyways like a warning siren no one asked for. You spot a man hauling a cart piled with firewood, each log gleaming wet with melted frost. He's followed by a desperate swarm of neighbors, haggling, pleading, and at times outright shoving for a chance to buy. Wood in Paris is as good as gold this season, and people trade coins, clothes, and sometimes even labor, just to keep their hearths alive. The irony isn't lost on you. This city of stone and wealth is being humbled by simple trees. Imagine trying to explain to someone in the future that, yes, the survival of thousands depended on whether a guy with a hatchet had a productive morning. And here's a detail that makes you shiver more than the wind. Sometimes, coffins were burned when wood ran out. That's right. Families would unearth old wooden caskets, break them apart, and toss them into the fire to stay alive. It's grim recycling at its peak, and historians still debate how common it was. But the fact that it's even recorded should tell you just how far people would go. You'd never look at your grandma's oak chest the same way again, knowing it might double as fuel. The churches are buzzing too, though not with warmth. Priests thunder about sin, insisting the cold is God's way of testing Paris. You shuffle into Notre Dame, mostly to get out of the wind, and the air inside is no kinder. Breath fogs in the vaulted space, as the priest gestures wildly, painting pictures of fire and brimstone that feel almost cozy compared to what's outside. You catch yourself thinking, if hell is supposed to be hot, maybe that doesn't sound so bad right now. But you don't say it out loud. You'd rather not test how long a person lasts in a medieval dungeon. Nearby, someone mutters about the Seine freezing over. You picture it, a river that usually pulses with boats and trade transformed into a glittering slab of ice. It sounds beautiful until you realize what it means. No grain shipments, no fish pulled from its waters, no way to ferry goods across. The frozen river is like a locked gate, cutting off one of the city's lifelines. People can walk across it, sure, but they do so with more fear than joy, whispering prayers under their breath in case the ice decides to swallow them whole. And yet, in spite of the fear, the Seine sometimes became a playground. Children scraped together crude skates made from bones strapped to their shoes. sliding awkwardly across the ice while adults shouted warnings. You can't help but chuckle. Some things never change. Even in the Middle Ages, kids ignored every piece of parental advice and went headfirst into danger, laughing as they did it. You imagine the medieval equivalent of, "Don't try this at home," echoing across the riverbank. Night creeps in faster than you expect. Torches line the streets, but their glow is faint against the dark, swallowed by the thick fog of your own breath. You watch a family huddled around a brazier, their faces lit in flickering orange as they roast what looks suspiciously like rats. Protein is protein, you guess, though you'd swipe left on that dinner option if it popped up in your meal plan. The smell lingers in the air, sharp and oily, reminding you just how creative survival can get when winter tightens its grip. And still, laughter breaks through. A group of young men, their cheeks red from both wine and cold, stumble through the streets singing bawdy songs, clapping each other on the back as if the world isn't crumbling around them. Their joy feels defiant, a middle finger raised to the frost. You find yourself smiling, realizing that even misery has cracks where light sneaks through. You tuck your hands deeper into your cloak as you head toward the city gates, the wind howling louder, rattling shutters and sending icy needles against your skin. Paris is groaning under winter's weight, and you can feel it pressing on every stone, every voice, every heart. The city isn't dead, it's enduring, and you, trudging along with frozen toes, are just another witness to its stubborn heartbeat. The deeper you push into the city, the louder the stomachs growl, not just your own, but the whole of Paris. Hunger is everywhere, gnawing at people louder than any sermon. Grain prices shoot up like they're auditioning for the stock exchange centuries too early. And bread, the one staple no Parisian can live without, becomes both a treasure and a weapon. You pass a bakery with shutters half closed, a line snaking around the corner, every face pinched and grey. Mothers clutch their children close, muttering prayers that today they won't be turned away empty-handed. The baker, flour smeared across his cheeks, holds up loaves as though he were a priest offering communion. Except instead of blessings, he's dishing out arguments, coins slammed down, promises made, and sometimes fists flying. People don't fight for pride in these streets. They fight for crumbs. You watch as a man who seems too thin even to stand straight lunges for a loaf, only to be shoved aside by someone with a heavier purse. You almost expect a referee to blow a whistle, but no, just the muffled sobs of the man clutching his stomach. Here's a fact that doesn't make the history books in big, bold letters: sawdust bread. Yes, when wheat ran out, bakers mixed flour with ground-up bark or sawdust to stretch it further. It filled bellies, sure, but at the cost of health. Imagine biting into bread that tastes like you're chewing a plank of wood. You'd think twice about complaining over store-brand cereal after that. Historians still debate how widespread this desperate trick was, but the accounts are there, haunting, like splinters in memory. The taverns, meanwhile, are stuffed fuller than bellies. You duck into one, the air hot and sour with sweat, smoke, and cheap ale. Everyone crowds the hearth, tankards clutched like lifelines. The conversations are less about joy and more about survival. Rumors of caravans bringing grain, whispers that the king's court will intervene, mutterings that the clergy are hoarding supplies. Each rumor spreads like fire in dry straw, flaring hope and then burning out into ash. You sip something that tastes vaguely like vinegar, pretending to be wine, and realize why people drink so much. They'd rather drown their hunger than feel it. And then there's the darker edge: riots. They don't erupt every day, but you can feel them simmering under the surface. People mutter about bakers hiding grain in cellars, about merchants charging double, about nobles feasting in their gilded halls while the poor gnaw on roots. One spark, one rumor too sharp, and the streets explode. Stones fly, shutters slam, guards march in, and the whole city holds its breath. It's chaos dressed up as justice. Still, Paris finds strange ways to keep going. You watch children play a lopsided game with a frozen turnip, their laughter ringing through the alley like silver bells. For a moment you forget the cold, the hunger, the fear. Their joy is fragile like ice on the Seine, but it holds. And you realize, sometimes surviving isn't about bread or fire. It's about finding a reason to laugh when the world tells you not to. As you step back into the night, your breath a cloud before you. The city feels like it's vibrating between collapse and defiance. The hunger will not ease soon, and the people know it. But for now, Paris keeps breathing. One loaf, one pint, one song at a time. The tension finally snaps. You hear it before you see it. The roar of a crowd echoing through frozen streets, the thunder of boots on cobblestones, the crash of shutters being torn from their hinges. Paris is rioting. Hunger has boiled over into fury, and the city itself seems to tremble with the sound. You move with the crowd, swept along like a twig in a river, though this river is made of fists, shouts, and desperation. At the center of it all is a bakery, its door barricaded from within. People pound on it with fists, stones, even bits of wood torn from wagons. They hide the flour. Someone screams. They keep it for the nobles. Another howls. You see a woman, her face drawn tight with anger, heft a bucket and fling it against the shutters. Water which freezes instantly into ice, as if even the weather wants to hammer home the point. The baker inside doesn't dare open the door. You imagine him crouched behind sacks of flour, trembling, knowing no crust of bread could ever satisfy this mob. Guards finally arrive, halberds glinting, armor clattering as they shove their way into the melee. But instead of calming the crowd, their presence pours oil on fire. The people turn on them. After all, the guards eat, the king eats, the clergy eats. Why should they go hungry? Stones fly. A helmet rings like a cracked bell, and the air fills with the bitter stink of sweat, fear, and frost. You can almost hear history whispering, "This isn't the last time Paris will riot over bread." Here's the twist that makes you shake your head. Sometimes the authorities gave in. Grain would be seized from warehouses and distributed under watchful eyes, like a miser, handing out coins one by one. Other times prices were fixed by decree. Though bakers grumbled it would ruin them. The balance was absurd, too high and the poor starved. Too low and the bakers starved. Either way, someone was always furious. Historians still debate whether these early bread riots were the seeds of later revolutions, or just the same old survival story replayed like a grim loop. And yet, even amid chaos, Paris finds its strange rhythm. In one corner, a priest waves a crucifix trying to calm the crowd, though his trembling hand betrays more fear than faith. In another, a group of boys slip through the crowd, snatching scraps of bread that fall in the scuffle, laughing as though it's just another game. It's surreal, watching fury and play tangled together in the same icy square. Eventually the mob thins, people dispersing back into the shadows, their anger only half-sated, their bellies still hollow. Broken shutters hang loose, stones lie scattered like discarded bones, and the silence that follows is almost worse than the riot itself. You walk through the wreckage, the air sharp with smoke from overturned torches, and you can't help but think, the city may calm tonight, but hunger will be back tomorrow, pacing the streets like a wolf that never tires. Still, in the quiet aftermath, you notice something odd. A neighbor helping another pick up spilled onions, a stranger sharing half a crust. Survival isn't just teeth and fists. Sometimes it's hands extended in the dark. And you realize, Paris, for all its fury, is also stitched together by moments of stubborn kindness. The riot's echoes fade, but winter doesn't care. It keeps grinding its teeth against the city, and soon even the Seine itself yields. You walk to its banks one morning, your breath puffing like smoke, and you see it. The river is frozen solid, locked tight in a sheet of ice so wide and pale, it looks like a mirror dropped from heaven. Barges that once ferried grain and wine sit trapped, useless hulks now fused into the glassy surface. The lifeline of Paris has been gagged by winter's fist. At first, people marvel. Children run onto the frozen water, shrieking as they skid and slide, their laughter echoing strangely against the quiet air. A boy dares to hammer the ice with a stick, but it only chips his stick to splinters. A group of women cross cautiously with baskets on their heads, cutting across what yesterday was rushing current, now a gleaming highway of frost. You can almost hear them muttering thanks for the shortcut, though each step carries the silent prayer that the ice holds. But soon the marvel sours. Without barges, supplies can't reach the city. The market stalls grow barer by the day, and bread grows thinner, harder, stretched with anything. Sawdust, ground peas, even powdered bones. You bite into it and feel your teeth ache, as though the loaf itself resents being eaten. And when the frost cracks in the night, booming like cannons, you wake with your heart pounding, convinced the earth itself is breaking beneath you. Here's the strange twist. The frozen Seine also became a stage. Some Parisians, refusing to be cowed, turned it into a carnival. Bonfires were lit on the ice, jugglers and fiddlers performed, and merchants sold roasted chestnuts right there on the frozen water. For a moment, it felt like a fairground suspended between survival and madness. Imagine skating, or rather sliding clumsily in wooden shoes, while the same ice that starved you also made you laugh. Historians still debate whether these frost fairs were desperate escapism or a collective act of defiance against winter itself. Still, the danger never left. Horses hauling carts across the river sometimes broke through, dragging driver and load into the black, freezing water. The sound of screaming mixed with the cracking ice left you with a pit in your stomach that no meager bread could fill. You stand at the banks and watch men poke the ice with poles before stepping forward, their bodies hunched like gamblers making the ultimate bet. And when night falls, the Seine becomes eerie, a pale, silent scar running through the heart of the city. Torches flicker along its banks, throwing shadows across the frozen surface that look like ghosts gliding over the water. You wrap your cloak tighter, telling yourself it's just the light, just the wind, but your skin prickles anyway. After all, if the city's great river could be silenced, what else might winter take? Yet amid the dread, you catch another detail. Lovers walking hand in hand across the ice, laughing at their own daring, as though mocking the cold. Life, stubborn and reckless, refuses to be entirely smothered. And you, watching, realize that survival in this winter isn't just about food or fire. It's about finding a reason to keep moving forward, even if it's just the joy of hearing your boots thump safely on the other side. You step away from the frozen river and back into the city's veins, those crooked streets where homes huddle together like teeth chattering against the cold. Inside, survival becomes an art of improvisation. Firewood is scarce, and when you do find it, it costs more than some families earn in a week. So people burn whatever they can. Broken furniture, scraps of old carts, even woven baskets torn apart for kindling. The smell of smoke drifting from chimneys isn't the sweet scent of oak, but the acrid stench of desperation. You duck into a small wooden house, and the first thing that hits you is the dimness. Windows are covered with cloth or oiled parchment, their light choked off in favor of keeping the warmth in. A single brazier smolders in the middle, its coals glowing faintly like a dying heartbeat. Around it, the family huddles. Mother, father, children, all wrapped in layer upon layer of wool, leather, or whatever scraps of cloth they've stitched together. You watch as they take turns holding their hands over the brazier, only to snatch them back when the faint heat threatens to scorch. The meals are just as stark. Porridge made from barley or rye, stretched with water until it resembles more soup than food. Sometimes, if luck favors them, a sliver of salted fish is added, a prize carefully divided into bites so small you almost lose it on your tongue. The children suck on bones long since stripped of meat, as though trying to extract one last ghost of flavor. Your stomach growls just watching them, but theirs are louder, a constant chorus of complaint against hunger. Here's an odd detail. Many Parisians stuffed their clothing with straw or moss, creating makeshift insulation. It rustled when they moved, turning every step into a dry whisper, as if the city itself were speaking in brittle voices. Historians still debate whether this was common practice, or just a quirk mentioned in a handful of records, but the image of entire families crunching like scarecrows as they walked has a peculiar charm to it, don't you think? Sleep, when it comes, is communal. Everyone piles into one bed, sharing body heat like a human furnace. If you've ever shared a blanket with someone who hogs all the covers, imagine multiplying that irritation by 5. Yet in those cramped beds, with straw mattresses creaking and wool blankets scratchy against skin, families found a warmth they couldn't get from wood or fire. The snoring of a father, the restless kicks of a child, the quiet murmurs of prayer before sleep, all became part of the soundtrack of survival. You sit by the brazier long enough to notice your eyes stinging from the smoke, curling through the room. There's no chimney here, just a hole in the roof that drafts as much cold air as it lets smoke escape. The air tastes like ash, your throat itches, and yet the family barely coughs anymore. They've grown used to it. You, on the other hand, feel your chest tightening and wonder how many winters a pair of lungs could survive in such a place. And still, amid the bleakness, humor survives. Her father jokes that the family dog sleeps closer to the coals than he does, and the beast pays no rent. The children giggle, muffling their laughter in the folds of their mother's skirts. You realize that laughter, like fire, is fuel. It may not warm your hands, but it softens the edges of the cold pressing in from every wall. Outside, the wind howls against the shutters, rattling them like bones. You step back into the street, where the cold bites harder for the absence of that faint brazier glow. The houses rise around you, each one holding its own battle against the season, each chimney puffing out a tired exhale. Paris in winter is less a city and more a patchwork of little islands, each one struggling not to sink beneath the frost. You leave behind the smoky little house, stepping back into the icy maze of streets, and your ears prick to new sounds. The shuffle of ragged boots, the occasional rattle of a wooden cup, and a low chant that almost melts into the wind. Beggars haunt the corners like shadows given voices, their faces gaunt, their fingers trembling, each one bundled in layers of whatever scraps they've scavenged. Some crouch by doorways, others lean against walls, eyes half-lidded, mouths open as though their breath alone might summon charity. You pause by one figure, wrapped in a patched cloak that might once have been teal, but now looks like muddy grey. His beard bristles with frost, and when he speaks it comes out in a rasp that feels heavier than the air itself. He asks for alms, but more often than not people pass him by, clutching their cloaks tighter. Poverty isn't unusual. It's practically the city's winter uniform. The problem is, in this season, poverty becomes a death sentence. You realize quickly that coins aren't always given. Sometimes bread crusts or a hot drink are more valuable. It's here you stumble on something stranger, the watchmen. They patrol the streets with lanterns swinging on iron hooks, their shadows stretching long across the snow. Each man wears a thick wool hood, a cudgel at his belt, and eyes sharpened by long, cold nights. They aren't merely keeping thieves at bay. They're listening for cries, for the hush of danger that comes when the cold makes men desperate. Some patrols even double as charity, carrying loaves to hand out to the most pitiful. Others, less kindly, drive beggars out of doorways with gruff shouts, as though misery itself were an offense against the city. Here's a little twist of history. In Paris, some beggars organized themselves into brotherhoods, almost like unions of poverty. They claimed corners, shared arms, and even had their own crude codes of conduct. Historians still debate whether these beggars' guilds were real or just moralizing inventions by chroniclers. But the idea of organized panhandlers dividing up territory like medieval businessmen feels absurdly believable. The streets themselves are as much enemy as refuge. Cobblestones freeze slick, turning every step into a gamble. You watch one woman slip, the loaf of bread she carried flying into the slush, where 3 children dive after it like sparrows at crumbs. She curses, but not loudly. Voices carry too easily in the cold, and one never knows who's listening. You glance upward, where the buildings lean over the street like conspirators. Icicles hang from eaves, glistening in the pale glow of lanterns. They look beautiful until one cracks and falls, spearing the ground with a sharp crack. You wince and imagine the headlines if it happened today. Death by frozen toothpick, Paris edition. In one square, a group of beggars has clustered around a brazier set up by monks. The flames crackle, and bowls of thin soup are ladled out to those who shuffle forward. You notice that some people hover nearby, too proud or too ashamed to join the line. Pride, it turns out, is one of the few things that survives the cold intact. As you move along, the watchmen pause to question you. Where are you headed? What's your business? Their tone isn't hostile, just worn, as though they've asked the same question 1,000 times already. You realize that in this season, suspicion doubles as survival. Every stranger could be a thief, every hungry man a danger. And yet there are moments of warmth. You see a boy sneak a chunk of bread into the hand of a sleeping beggar, darting away before anyone notices. A watchman coughs into his cloak, then leaves a coin by the brazier before marching on. Even in the harshest cold, little embers of humanity refuse to be snuffed out. The city feels like a stage where every player, beggar, guard, merchant, noble, performs their role under the same winter spotlight. And you, weaving between them, can't help but wonder which role you'd have drawn if you'd been born in this age. Would you carry the lantern, beg by the brazier, or shuffle past with your cloak drawn tight? You decide to slip away from the brazier's glow and follow the sound of bells, those muffled tolls rolling across rooftops like waves in slow motion. They guide you toward the bulk of stone that looms above the crooked houses, Paris's great churches. Their silhouettes rise like mountains of faith, defying the cold with sheer presence, and as you step closer, the winter-dark streets suddenly bloom with light spilling from tall arched windows. Inside, the air is no warmer, but it feels different, thick with incense, heavy with murmurs, The flicker of hundreds of candles painting the stone walls gold. You tread across flagstones worn smooth by generations of knees, and every sound, your breath, your footsteps, seems instantly swallowed by the vastness of the nave. People gather here not only to pray, but to escape the bite of the night. Families huddle together. Beggars find corners to rest in without being chased off. There the devout bow their heads so deeply you'd think they're trying to tuck into invisible scarves. And yet the spectacle is mesmerizing. Candlelight climbs high up pillars carved with saints and angels, turning them into watchful guardians above the crowd. The choir hums in low, steady tones, and their voices mingle with the smoke curling toward the vaulted ceiling. For a moment, you forget the frozen gutters outside, the icicles waiting to spear careless heads, the coughing fits that echo down alleys. Here there's a fragile kind of peace, like the cold has been momentarily exorcised by ritual. A priest's sermon cuts through the chant, delivered in Latin that most people don't fully understand. That doesn't matter. Tone, rhythm, and gesture are everything. He warns of sin, of punishment, of the eternal fire that feels strangely believable when you've been living in a city half frozen. Fire, after all, isn't just metaphor here. It's something you crave in your bones. You smirk a little at the thought, repent or roast forever. Probably landed harder on people who couldn't even keep their stew boiling at home. And here's a curious little truth. Churches in winter often doubled as makeshift shelters, whether priests liked it or not. The poor sneaked in to sleep by candle stubs, or huddle against warm stones where the sun had touched them by day. Some monks even looked the other way, quietly handing out bread to keep the half-starved alive. Historians still debate whether this was charity born of compassion or strategy to keep unrest in check, because a hungry crowd can riot faster than you can light a votive candle. The soundscape inside is hypnotic. Coughing, whispering, chanting, all merging into a single hum like the city's heartbeat. Children chase one another between pillars until a stern nun catches them and drags them back to sit down. A man snores in a pew, head tilted so far back his mouth looks like it's ready to swallow a hymn. You half expect someone to throw a cloak over him. But no. Fatigue is its own liturgy here. As you gaze up at stained glass darkened by night, you imagine how dazzling it must look in summer, sunlight scattering like jewels. But tonight the glass just frames the blackness outside, and you can almost feel the city pressing against it. The hunger, the cold, the endless need. The contrast is striking. Inside, fragile light. Outside, brutal night. Still, the church isn't entirely safe. The draft seeps through cracks, and sometimes the icy air swirls the candle smoke into odd shapes. Little demons dancing overhead. People cross themselves quickly, muttering prayers as though the cold itself were possessed. You can't blame them, after all. In this age, every unexplained creak or chill could mean the devil's work. You step back toward the great doors, watching the way they swing open to reveal the snow-glittered city beyond. People shuffle in, stamp their feet, and pull their hoods low. Others leave reluctantly, bracing themselves for the long walk home. You drift toward the markets, drawn by the muffled chorus of voices that somehow still lingers, even in the dead of winter. The closer you get, the more the air sharpens with a mix of smells: smoke, damp wool, stale fish, and that faint metallic tang of iron pots, simmering with whatever scraps people can scrounge. The stalls huddle together like teeth in a crooked smile, each draped in canvas stiff with frost. Vendors stamp their feet to keep the blood moving, shouting their wares in voices cracked from cold. You see a butcher, hacking at a slab of meat so frozen it might as well be marble. Each swing of his cleaver rings out like a church bell, sharp and echoing through the narrow lanes. Shoppers gather with cautious eyes, weighing whether today's purchase is worth tomorrow's hunger. Bread is there too, hard loaves stacked, like bricks, each one costing a fortune thanks to poor harvests and frozen fields. You smirk, forget Bitcoin bubbles. Medieval bread inflation could break your soul, and yet the market is alive. Children dart between legs, chasing each other until they skid on patches of ice and tumble laughing into piles of hay. A woman with saffron-colored ribbons sells steaming bowls of pottage, the scent of barley and leeks curling like hope through the icy air. It isn't much, but when your stomach's been gnawing at itself for hours, that thin stew feels like heaven ladled into wood. Here's a detail that slips through history's cracks. Some stalls sold not food, but warmth. Candle makers hawked Wax tapers by the handful, while charcoal burners offered small clay pots filled with glowing embers, pocket furnaces for anyone who could pay. Imagine handing over a day's wages for the right to carry a cup of fire in your palms. Historians still debate whether these little luxuries were a genuine kindness or just another way for merchants to squeeze coins out of desperation. You pause, near a fishmonger's table, the catch glittering with a glaze of ice. He slaps a salted herring onto the counter, then blows into his hands, muttering about how even the Seine seems stingy this year. The river, half frozen, offers fewer fish, and what remains fetches prices fit for a king. Still, customers crowd around. Lent rules mean meatless meals and fish is salvation on a plate. You can almost hear the collective sigh of medieval vegetarians who never signed up for this. Not far away, cloth sellers wave bolts of indigo and russet wool, showing off the heavy weave meant to keep the frost at bay. You run your hand across it, the texture rough but comforting, and imagine how many hours went into shearing, spinning, and dyeing before it reached this stall. Clothes weren't just fashion here. They were armor against the cold, and if you couldn't afford them, well, you layered rags until you looked like a walking laundry line. The sounds of barter fill the air, arguments over the price of onions, laughter when someone tries to pass off watered-down ale, groans when a coin is dropped and lost forever in the snow. There's a rhythm to it, a heartbeat of survival. Markets weren't just about buying and selling. They were the city's lungs, the place where gossip, news, and stories flowed faster than coin. A man beside you whispers about nobles feasting in warm halls, while his own family scrapes by on turnips. A woman complains that the bread weighs less than yesterday. You catch the undertone of every voice, fear wrapped in routine. Everyone knows famine is only ever one bad season away, and winter makes that threat feel like it's already knocking on the door. Still, there's resilience. A fiddler in a teal cloak sets up near a barrel fire, playing a tune sharp enough to make feet tap in the slush. For a moment, the market feels less like survival and more like community. People smile, share bowls, even dance a little. You realize that in this bleak season, joy is as precious a commodity as bread. As the sun sinks lower and the sky bruises into deep purple, the stalls begin to close. Merchants pack up, stamping snow off boots, their goods bundled in carts. The market empties, leaving only footprints and the faint smell of smoke. You stand in the hush, the echo of laughter still lingering like a ghost. You decide to follow the curl of smoke, and the faint echoes of music drifting toward the noble quarters. The cobblestones grow smoother beneath your boots, the streets wider and the houses taller, their shutters painted in bright hues that haven't yet been scoured by hunger. It feels like stepping into another world, a pocket of warmth and wealth carved into the frost-bitten city. The air itself smells different here, less of smoke and rot, more of spiced wine, roasting meats, and beeswax candles. You pass guards posted at heavy wooden gates, their armor glinting faintly in the torchlight. Their cheeks are red from the cold, but their bellies don't look empty. One yawns, rubbing his hands together, while another chews on a hunk of bread far softer than anything you saw at the market. You can't help but think, security guard perks haven't changed much. Access to food and a paycheck while everyone else freezes. Inside the courtyards, you glimpse noble ladies wrapped in saffron and indigo cloaks, their breath steaming as they hurry from carriage to hall. Their shoes barely touch the slush, thanks to servants laying down straw mats. Imagine having someone whose job is literally to stop your feet from getting wet. That's medieval VIP treatment. And then you hear it, the muffled hum of a feast underway. Laughter and music spill out of tall stone halls, windows glowing with candlelight. You peek through a crack and see a scene that feels almost obscene after the market. Tables groan under platters of venison, goose, and trout, swimming in saffron broth. Golden goblets clink. Wine flows like rivers, and hands reach for trenchers piled with warm, soft bread. Somewhere a bard strums a lute, weaving songs about chivalry and courtly love while a dog dozes by the fire, belly swollen from scraps. Here's a detail many miss. Nobles didn't just eat better. They ate theatrically. Feasts were about showing power as much as filling stomachs. Whole roasted peacocks were served with feathers reattached, shimmering like trophies on a plate. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles crowned the tables, and spiced almond milk poured from pitchers, as though luxury itself had been liquefied. Historians still debate whether these displays were meant more for taste or spectacle, but either way, they turned dinner into propaganda. You notice, though, the contrast beneath the laughter. A servant limps past, carrying a tray so heavy he nearly stumbles. Another shivers each time the door opens, exposed to the winter draught, while the nobles fuss over whether their swan should be served with or without sauce. Luxury here comes at the cost of unseen hands working themselves numb. And yet even in this opulence, winter's shadow lingers. You catch snippets of conversation, worries about dwindling grain, about merchants charging double, about rumors of unrest bubbling among the city's poorer quarters. Nobles laugh, but their eyes dart like candle flames in a draught, as if they know their walls are tall but not unbreachable. There's irony, too. While peasants risk frostbite for firewood, nobles complain about smoke staining the tapestries. While market folk dream of a crust of bread, nobles fret that the imported figs taste less sweet this year. You almost want to clap and say, "Bravo, your suffering is truly unbearable." But you hold your tongue. The guards look like they wouldn't appreciate sarcasm. Still, the warmth here is intoxicating. The fire roars, the music swells, and for a moment you could almost forget the frozen streets outside. You could almost believe Paris is a city of endless light and feasting. Almost. But as you step back from the glow, the cold rushes in again, harsher now, as if to remind you where you belong. The noble quarters fade behind you, and your steps carry you toward the rougher streets where the taverns flicker, with their own kind of warmth. Not gilded, but human, because in those dim rooms, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the poor fight the winter not with gold, but with laughter, ale, and stubborn resilience. And that's where your path leads next, into the smoky heart of a medieval tavern, where survival tastes like sour wine, and hope clings to every note of a song. The air grows denser with smoke and laughter, as you duck beneath the low lintel of a tavern, shoulders brushing rough wood worn smooth by countless hands. Inside, the world tilts away from noble halls into something far messier and far more alive. The smell hits first: sour wine, damp wool, old straw scattered across the floor, and something frying in a pan that you pray is meat but wouldn't bet on. Benches groan under the weight of laborers packed tight together, cheeks flushed red from cheap ale. Someone strums a fiddle out of tune and the crowd doesn't care. They stomp their boots in rhythm anyway, mugs clattering like percussion. You slide into a corner, the heat of bodies immediately thawing the sting of the frost still clinging to your cloak. For the first time all night, you feel your fingers again, and it's glorious. Drinks are flowing faster than reason. Tankards slosh, jokes are shouted, and arguments flare just as quickly. A baker's apprentice accuses a mason of shorting him on stone. A seamstress laughs so hard she nearly topples backward, saved only by a neighbor's quick grab. It's chaotic, sweaty, and wonderfully human, the opposite of the stiff rituals you saw in the noble feast. Here's the fun part. Taverns weren't just about drinking. They were medieval Wi-Fi hotspots, buzzing with news and gossip. A traveler claims he saw wolves circling just outside the city walls. Another whispers about a noble, scandalous affair. And someone insists the king's tax collector froze to death on the road. Wishful thinking, most likely. Historians still debate how much real information spread in these smoky rooms versus pure rumor. But either way, it shaped how people understood their world. And the food? Well, food is generous. You might get a hunk of rye bread tougher than the table it's served on, or a bowl of pottage so mysterious, even the cook would struggle to identify its ingredients. Every so often, though, there's a treat: roasted chestnuts, salted herring, or a meat pie if the tavern's doing well. It's not glamorous, but after a day of empty stomachs, it feels like treasure. You glance toward the hearth, where the tavern keeper's dog guards a pot, eyes narrowed, as if daring anyone to take a spoonful without paying. Nearby, dice clatter across a table. Gambling is as inevitable here as spilled ale, and you hear groans and cheers as fortunes of a few coins rise and fall. Someone swears he rolled fair, someone else swears he didn't, and before you know it, a scuffle breaks out, quickly doused by the barkeep's wooden ladle smacked firmly across both their heads. Medieval customer service at its finest. There's music too, of course. Not the elegant lutes of the noble hall, but a raspy-voiced singer belting out a ballad about lost love and bad ale. Everyone joins in on the chorus, out of tune but united. For a moment, the hardships of frost and hunger dissolve into the warm haze of community. It's messy, it's loud, and it's exactly what people cling to when the world outside feels unlivable. And yet, as much as the tavern offers escape, shadows still creep in. You overhear mutters about the rising price of grain, about thieves who prey on the desperate, about fevers spreading in the poorer quarters. Laughter falters when someone coughs too hard, then resumes with nervous energy. The tavern is both shield and reminder. The walls keep the cold out, but they can't shut out fear. Still, when another round of ale is poured, you raise your mug like the rest, because tonight is about surviving winter one sip, one song, one story at a time. And as you leave the smoky warmth behind, stepping back into the icy streets, you realize where your path will lead next. To the homes of ordinary families, where survival doesn't depend on feasts or taverns, but on the stubborn rituals of daily life. You leave the raucous hum of the tavern behind, the laughter fading into the night air, and turn down a narrower street where lanterns hang low, their glow faint against the frost. Here the noise of Paris is softer, replaced by the muffled rhythm of footsteps in snow and the occasional creak of shutters. You find yourself at the threshold of a humble home, its wooden door patched and warped, smoke trickling from a chimney no bigger than your arm. You step inside, ducking beneath the frame, and suddenly you're in the quiet heart of medieval survival, the family hearth. The room is small, one space serving every purpose at once. A low fire flickers in the hearth, its flames barely clinging to a pile of damp logs. Smoke lingers stubbornly because the chimney doesn't quite do its job, so the air tastes of ash and pine. Your eyes sting, but compared to the cold outside, this smoky cocoon feels like paradise. A clay pot hangs above the embers, filled with thin pottage, a watery stew of barley, onions, and maybe a few stray scraps of bacon, if the family was lucky today. You lean closer and realize the stew has that Tuesday mystery flavor vibe that still exists centuries later. A woman kneels nearby, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon that's been worn smooth by years of use. Children cluster around her, wrapped in rough wool, their cheeks red from the cold. The eldest boy tries to act brave, poking at the fire to keep it alive, while the youngest, barely more than a toddler, gnaws on a piece of stale bread with the determination of someone tackling a medieval jawbreaker. The father, boots still dusted with snow, sits in silence, hands calloused from work in the fields or the market. You notice how he keeps glancing toward the door, as if worried the cold itself might find its way inside. Meals like this were more about warmth than taste. For most Parisians, bread was the foundation of life, sometimes making up 3/4 of their calories. And not fluffy baguettes either, dense dark loaves that could double as self-defense weapons if needed. Historians still debate whether these breads were always nourishing, or if famine years filled them with fillers like ground peas or even sawdust. But either way, families clung to them as lifelines. The pottage bubbles slowly, and the mother ladles out small portions, careful to make it stretch. Each child receives their share, dipping bread into the broth with a focus that feels almost ceremonial. There's no silverware here, just wooden bowls and spoons passed down, some cracked and repaired with strips of iron. And yet in this simple act of sharing food, there's a comfort that grand feasts can't replicate. You realize survival isn't about abundance. It's about small flames that refuse to die out. Every corner of the room tells a story. A low bed is tucked against the wall, shared by most of the family, its straw mattress flattened from use. A small chest holds their meager possessions. A wool cloak, perhaps a rosary, maybe a knife or two. Herbs dry above the hearth, sage, thyme, rosemary, used not just for flavor but for medicine and protection. The faint scent of lavender lingers, meant to ward off pests and perhaps evil spirits too. Life here is fragile, yet rhythms persist. The family prays together, murmuring words that blur with the crackle of the fire. The children whisper about the cold, one claiming he saw a wolf at the edge of town, the other laughing nervously. The father tells them stories, not of knights or kings, but of neighbors and ancestors who endured worse winters and still saw spring. You sense that storytelling, as much as bread or fire, is what keeps them alive. And there's something else: community. The door creaks open, and a neighbor enters carrying a small bundle, extra firewood wrapped in cloth. It's an unspoken rule. When you have a little more, you share, because next week you might be the one needing help. In times of scarcity, generosity wasn't charity. It was insurance for survival. You sip the warmth of the moment, listening to the murmur of voices, the pop of the fire, the scratch of straw as someone shifts in the bed. It's modest, fragile, and utterly human. And as you step back outside into the cold night, your path draws you further still, toward the darker alleys, where survival doesn't depend on family hearths, but on the harsh grind of labor and the shadows of poverty. The warm glow of the family hearth fades as you step back into the streets, the snow crunching beneath your boots once more. The wind snakes its way between the crooked houses, sharp as a knife against your cheeks, and you notice the shift immediately. The laughter and hum of households are gone, replaced by silence broken only by coughing in the dark. You've crossed into the poorer quarters of medieval Paris, where survival wasn't cozy. It was constant negotiation with hunger and cold. You pass figures hunched beneath cloaks, patched so many times they resemble quilts of desperation. Their steps drag, their faces hollowed by winters without enough bread. Beggars sit near the doorways of churches, hands outstretched, their voices raspy with pleas. Alms for the poor, they whisper, the words as thin as the soup they'll never taste. You feel the sting of guilt, even though you carry nothing in your hands. To walk past them is easy, but to forget their eyes harder. In winter, work dried up along with the fields. Laborers who hauled goods along the Seine in warmer months now had nothing to carry but the weight of their own emptiness. Artisans without orders sat idle, their calloused hands itching for tools they could not afford to use. Bread prices spiked with the scarcity of grain, and for some families, one loaf meant the difference between life and death. Historians still debate whether famine years were worsened by climate, poor harvests, or political mismanagement, but the effect was the same: more mouths than meals. Children, barefoot in the snow, scavenged for firewood, tiny twigs, broken crates, anything that would burn. You watch one boy pry a scrap of wood from a collapsed cart, his fingers raw and purple, his prize no larger than your forearm. His mother, waiting nearby with a bundle of rags, nods with weary relief, as though that small stick might save them. It won't, but hope stretches even thinner than soup here. And then there are the makeshift shelters. Not everyone had walls to retreat to. In corners where alleys meet, families huddled under lean-tos of canvas or bundled reeds. You glimpse one such scene, a woman cradling her baby against her chest, the child swaddled in fabric so threadbare the cold passes through as easily as air through lace. She rocks back and forth, singing softly, not a lullaby of comfort, but one of distraction, to keep the baby from crying, to convince herself she has control. The church, for all its wealth, offered limited aid. Monasteries ran alms kitchens, handing out bowls of gruel that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Parish priests preached patience, reminding the poor that heaven was rich even if earth was cruel. Some sermons comforted. Others sounded more like lectures from someone who'd never shivered through the night. And yet for the poor, faith was both balm and leash, hope for salvation, fear of damnation if they strayed too far. You can almost feel the desperation solidify in the air. It's thicker here, heavier, as though every breath carries the weight of centuries of want. Neighbors share what little they have: bread crusts, scraps of lard, a spoonful of stew stretched thin enough to see the bottom of the pot. In some cases, they shared nothing at all. Survival can foster kindness, but it can also sharpen suspicion, and in winters like these, trust was often the first thing to freeze. Still, resilience glimmers in small moments. A man kneels to tie his daughter's shoe with twine scavenged from the market, his fingers clumsy but determined. A young girl, hair tangled and frost-kissed, draws circles with her finger on a frost-covered wall, pretending it's chalk on a slate. Laughter bursts brief and bright from a group of boys tossing snow at one another, an act of rebellion against misery itself. As you watch, the truth of medieval poverty presses against you. Survival wasn't noble, it wasn't romantic. It was scraping, scratching, finding small scraps of warmth where none should exist. And as you turn a corner, drawn by the sound of running water, you realize your next step takes you toward another crucial thread of winter life: the frozen Seine itself, artery and lifeline of the city, where hunger and survival played out on a broader stage. The Seine lies ahead like a broad ribbon of steel, its surface glazed with ice that catches what little moonlight filters through the clouds. You approach the riverbank, boots slipping on frosted cobblestones, and for a moment the sight almost feels magical, like the city has been wrapped in glass. But magic is thin when bellies are empty. And the Seine in winter was no postcard. It was a stage where survival and commerce collided. You hear the groaning of wood as barges, stuck fast in the ice, strain against their moorings. Traders curse under their breath, kicking frozen ropes with boots as stiff as boards. Without the river's flow, goods piled up. Grain meant to be sold, firewood meant to be carted. Even fish caught downstream, everything stalled, everything delayed. Prices rose not because there was nothing, but because the Seine had locked it all away beneath a shimmering prison. Historians still debate how much of Paris's winter hunger was due to climate itself, or the chokehold of frozen trade routes like this. Closer to the shore, children skate cautiously along the edge, their laughter thin but genuine. They push one another across the slick ice on makeshift sleds, planks nailed together, ropes fraying anything that could glide. Their cheeks are flushed, their breath fogs the air, and for a brief moment you think, joy is stubborn, it claws its way in even when the world says no. Then you notice the watchful mothers at the bank, clutching shawls tight, their eyes fixed not on the games, but on the cracks spidering near the center of the ice. You tread carefully along the Pont au Change, the bridge lined with wooden houses that lean precariously over the river. Their eaves drip icicles sharp as daggers, and you can't help imagining one falling at just the wrong moment. Medieval insurance definitely wouldn't cover that. Merchants here sell candles, salt, and hard bread, their voices hoarse from calling out in the biting air. One baker gestures toward a tray of loaves so tough they might double as building bricks, joking, "Chew slowly, or you'll lose your teeth." No one laughs too loudly. Dentistry wasn't exactly thriving further downriver. You glimpse something quieter. Washerwomen crouched by holes broken into the ice, sleeves rolled up, arms plunged into water so cold it burns. They scrub cloth against stones, their breath hissing through clenched teeth, muttering prayers and curses in the same rhythm. Their fingers are raw, nails cracked, but the work doesn't stop. Laundry didn't care that the river had frozen. Life was stubbornly practical. And then there's the darker side. Bodies sometimes pulled from the water, victims of accident or despair. You overhear whispers. Someone slipped after a night of too much wine, someone else stepped deliberately into the dark. Death on the Seine wasn't uncommon, but winter made it crueler, harder to ignore. The river held life and loss in equal measure, and the people of Paris lived with both. You pause on the bridge, leaning against the wooden railing, your breath clouding as you look down at the cracked reflection of the city. It's beautiful, yes, but also fragile. The ice may hold today, but tomorrow it could break. And beneath it all, the current still runs, unseen but unstoppable, as if reminding everyone that winter doesn't last forever. From here, the wind carries another sound, faint, rhythmic, metallic. The ringing of hammers, the clatter of wheels. You follow it away from the riverbank and toward the narrow streets of the craftsmen, where winter brought not stillness, but the grind of survival in another form. You step into the narrow lanes where the craftsmen work, and immediately the rhythm of the city shifts. The chill still bites at your ears, but here it mixes with the clang of hammers, the rasp of saws, and the thrum of looms. Workshops glow faintly through warped shutters, their fires burning hot against the encroaching cold, and the air smells of smoke, iron, and damp wool. It's not exactly cozy, but compared to the frozen Seine, it feels alive. Blacksmiths stand at their forges, sweat dripping even in this bitter winter, shirts damp beneath woolen vests. Sparks dance in the gloom as they strike hot iron, fashioning nails, horseshoes, hinges. Anything the city can't do without. You hear the hiss as glowing metal meets water, steam clouding up like a ghost and vanishing into the rafters. One smith laughs grimly. At least the fire keeps the frost from eating us alive. True enough, but step too close and the frost isn't the only thing that bites. Medieval OSHA would have had a field day. Further down, the air changes. You pass weavers, their shuttles clicking across looms, hands moving quick despite the cold stiffening their joints. Wool cloth stretches in muted shades of russet and indigo, dyed with plants carefully stored from autumn. The sound is hypnotic, clack, slide, pull, and you catch the pride in their eyes as the bolts of cloth grow inch by inch. Yet here's the irony. Much of that fabric is destined for wealthy buyers, while the weavers themselves make do with patched garments, their own fingers calloused from labor. Historians still debate whether guild rules protected craftsmen or trapped them, but in these streets, survival was never guaranteed. You stumble over a loose cobblestone and find yourself before a tanner's yard. The smell hits you first. Sharp, sour, something between vinegar and rot. Skins are stretched on frames, scraped clean with knives, then soaked in vats of foul-smelling liquid. Pigeon droppings, stale urine, yes, really. Everything that could strip and soften hides. The workers' faces are lined, their hands cracked, and their neighbors probably complained endlessly about the stench. But without them, there would be no boots, no belts, no armor straps. As unpleasant as it looks, it was the quiet backbone of the city's survival. Step a little further and the street narrows into the quarters of carpenters and coopers. You hear the ring of adzes shaping beams, the hollow echo of staves fitted into barrels. Wine and grain needed barrels as much as mouths needed food. One cooper sits on an upturned keg, cursing under his breath when a hoop slips free and clatters across the cobbles. His apprentice snickers, earning a sharp rap with a wooden mallet. Some lessons, it seems, never change, whether it's medieval workshops or modern offices. And through it all, voices rise in complaint. Orders delayed, wages late, customers demanding credit they don't deserve. Winter tightened belts in more ways than one, and disputes often spilled into shouting matches in the street. You sidestep a quarrel between a shoemaker and a baker, something about unpaid bread for boots, and wonder how many trades were really stitched together by barter more than coin. Yet amid the toil, you sense resilience. These craftsmen weren't just workers. They were the heartbeat of Paris. Every clang of metal, every swish of thread, every stink of tanned leather was a reminder that even in the harshest cold, the city refused to freeze solid. Life, stubborn and unyielding, pushed forward in sawdust and sparks. And then beyond the workshops, another scent calls you. Spices, roasting meat, mulled wine. The marketplace waits, bustling even in the depths of winter, a place where survival was bartered one handful at a time. You drift from the hammering of smiths and the stench of tanners into the heart of the marketplace, and suddenly Paris feels less like a frozen tomb and more like a frantic stage play. The square is crowded despite the biting wind, cloaks pulled tight, breath puffing like smoke from chimneys. Merchants shout over one another, their voices hoarse but determined, while customers shuffle through slush and mud, clutching baskets and purses, hoping to stretch a few coins through another week of cold. The first stall you pass is piled with bread. Round loaves, darker than you'd expect, their crusts hard as armor. Flour is expensive, and white bread is a luxury reserved for nobles and wealthy clergy. For everyone else, it's coarse rye or barley, sometimes bulked out with acorns or beans when harvests failed. You watch a mother haggle for 2 loaves, her fingers trembling as she counts out coppers. Bread was life in Paris, sometimes nearly 80% of a person's diet, and yet it could vanish overnight if weather turned or politics flared. Historians still argue whether famines were inevitable or man-made, but standing here, you just feel the hunger pressing in from every angle. Next comes meat, the smell rich, greasy, enticing, and faintly alarming. Sausages hang in coils, smoked to keep them from spoiling in the damp cold. Cuts of pork and beef lie on wooden tables, hacked roughly, the butcher's knife leaving no room for delicacy. Flies don't swarm in winter, which is one small mercy, but the meat still glistens ominously in the dim light. A man holds up a rabbit, its fur still clinging to the paws, and the butcher swears it's fresh from the hunt. You raise an eyebrow. Let's just say the medieval version of organic free-range was flexible. Then the spice sellers beckon, their stalls tiny kingdoms of scent. Little packets of saffron, pepper, cinnamon, treasures carried from distant lands. They're displayed like jewels, worth their weight in silver, sprinkled sparingly into sauces to hide the taste of meat past its prime. Customers lean in, inhaling, dreaming of warmth they can't quite afford. You hear one merchant brag that his pepper came from the ends of the earth. Whether that's true or not, no one here can prove him wrong. Medieval Yelp reviews weren't exactly an option. At the edge of the market, fishmongers call out, their stalls damp with melted ice. Eels squirm sluggishly in buckets, a staple for Fridays when meat was forbidden. Salted cod, stiff as planks, hangs in slabs carried inland from the coasts. The smell is briny, sharp, almost overwhelming, and you instinctively pull your cloak tighter against it. Still, for a city like Paris, fish wasn't just food, it was proof of faith, a reminder of religious rhythms that governed even the stomach. And then the chatter shifts to drink. Barrels of wine stand ready, though in truth much of it is sour, cut with spices or watered down. Hallet flows too, brewed thick and cloudy, safer than the Seine's questionable water. People laugh and complain around the wine stalls, their words slurred not just by drink but by exhaustion, a sip of warmth against the cold, a brief comfort in long winter nights. It's easy to see why alehouses thrived despite priests' grumbles. As you step back, you notice something subtle but powerful. The marketplace isn't just about buying and selling, it's about survival woven into community. News spreads here faster than in any cathedral. Whispers of famine, gossip about the king, rumors of wars far away. Deals are struck, debts remembered, friendships tested. You realize that in this frozen city, the marketplace is the beating heart, pumping food, goods, and stories into every alley and home. And beyond the square, rising above the chatter, you see it, Notre Dame. Its towers reaching skyward, bells waiting to toll across the rooftops. The cathedral isn't just stone and glass. It's a refuge, a reminder, and a looming presence over every market stall below. You leave the marketplace with the smell of fish still clinging to your cloak, and find your steps drawn toward the looming towers of Notre Dame. The bells aren't ringing now, but you feel their weight even in silence, a promise that at any moment the great bronze mouths could thunder across the city. The cathedral rises out of the cold like a mountain of stone, its flying buttresses arched against the grey winter sky. Gargoyles peering down as if amused by the tiny humans scurrying below. Stepping through its doors, the world shifts. The noise of the market fades, swallowed by vast echoes. Candles sputter, their flames trembling in the drafty chill, and the scent of wax and incense fills your lungs. The cold doesn't vanish. It clings stubbornly, pooling on the stone floor. But the cathedral feels warmer somehow, wrapped in ritual. You imagine yourself slipping onto a wooden bench, shoulders hunched, eyes drawn upward to stained glass windows that catch even the weakest sunlight and turn it into trembling rivers of color. Services here aren't optional. In medieval Paris, the church isn't just a place to pray. It's the backbone of community life. You join the crowd, peasants rubbing shoulders with merchants, nobles wrapped in fur, and monks gliding like shadows. Everyone listens as the priest's voice rolls through the nave, warning of sin, of famine, of plague as God's judgment. You can't help but notice, sermons aren't just theology. They're crowd control, a medieval version of public service announcements. Except instead of "don't litter," it's "don't anger the Almighty" or "burn for eternity." Effective, if a little heavy-handed, still there's beauty here. The organ rumbles, choirs sing in Latin, voices weaving together until the notes seem to shimmer in the cold air. You don't understand every word, but you don't need to. The sound itself is enough to stir your chest. For a moment, the winter outside feels far away, and you almost forget the gnaw of hunger or the ache of frostbitten fingers. Music, even in a drafty cathedral, can be better than any blanket. But there's also fear. In one corner, a confessional whispers with secrets. A man kneels, muttering about sins he can't quite name. A woman clutches her rosary so tightly her knuckles whiten, praying for her sick child at home. Rumors of witchcraft, whispers of heresy, all hover in the air alongside incense smoke. The church promises salvation, but it also reminds you constantly how thin the line is between heaven and hell. Historians still debate whether people truly believed every warning, or learned to tune it out like background noise. But sitting here with shadows stretching high above you, it's hard not to feel small. Outside again, the bells finally toll, their booming rhythm shaking the rooftops. The sound rolls over the city, echoing through alleys, bouncing off frozen stone, marking time in a world where days blur together. You wrap your cloak tighter, stepping into the cold once more. Behind you, Notre Dame looms like a guardian, or perhaps a judge, watching as you walk back into the ordinary life of Paris. And there, beyond the bells, your eyes catch another figure moving slowly along the street, a monk with parchment tucked under his arm, heading toward the safety of a cloister, where knowledge is copied, hoarded, and quietly preserved against the cold centuries. You trail the monk with your eyes until he disappears through an arched doorway, leaving behind only the faint rustle of parchment against his robe. The thought of a cloister draws you onward, and soon you find yourself inside the quiet walls of a monastery, where the hum of Paris fades into a softer rhythm. Here the world moves at the pace of quills scratching, candles burning, and pages turning. The cold seeps in even here. Stone walls don't care much about vows of silence, but somehow the stillness makes it feel less biting, As though contemplation itself generates a thin warmth, you enter the scriptorium, a long chamber lined with wooden desks. Monks sit hunched, cloaks wrapped tight, fingers stiff with chill, laboring over manuscripts. You hear the faint scrape of pen on vellum, the whisper of brushes applying gold leaf. Imagine writing for hours when the ink itself is freezing in the pot. You'd be tempted to doodle a snowman in the margins, but they preferred strange beasts and curling vines. Some of those playful doodles still survive today, hidden alongside solemn gospels. Rabbits jousting on snails, monks with fishtails. You can't help but think, even in a life of strict devotion, boredom left its mark. The cold complicates everything. Ink grows sluggish, wax cracks, parchment stiffens until it feels like frozen leather. A monk leans closer to a candle, squinting, his breath puffing white over the words he copies. They say knowledge is power, but in the Middle Ages it was also endurance training. These men weren't just preserving texts. They were battling frostbite one illuminated letter at a time. Historians still argue whether their strange doodles were rebellion or simple amusement. But you suspect it was both, an act of quiet humanity in the middle of sacred duty. The cloister outside offers little relief. Bare trees rattle in the winter wind, and the fountain in the courtyard stands frozen, a block of silence at the center of their world. The monks shuffle along cloaked corridors, whispering prayers, hands hidden inside wide sleeves. Meals are plain, bread hardened by the cold, thin stew steaming faintly in earthen bowls. Yet for all the austerity, there's a sense of calm, a structure that shields them from the chaos beyond. You imagine sitting with them at a long table, the silence broken only by the voice of a reader reciting scripture, while spoons scrape against bowls. It's not exactly dinner theater, but it does keep you from gossiping about who's stealing extra bread. And in this rhythm, you sense how monasteries offered more than faith. They offered stability in a city where hunger, plague, and politics churned endlessly. Leaving the cloister, you pull your cloak tighter and step back into the city. The wind bites harder now, reminding you that Paris doesn't pause for contemplation. The manuscripts stay safe inside the walls, but you must carry yourself onward, toward another corner of winter life. And as you move through narrow streets, you begin to hear a rougher kind of sound. Hammering, sawing, the clink of iron against stone. The artisans and laborers of Paris are still at work, no matter how cruel the season. The hammering draws you closer, echoing off frozen stone walls until it feels like the whole city has turned into one vast workshop. In the cramped lanes of Paris, artisans and laborers are bent over their work, breath puffing in frosty clouds, hands red and cracked from the cold. You pass a blacksmith's forge, where the fire roars defiantly against winter's grip. Sparks leap like fireflies, and the air smells of iron and smoke. For a moment, you envy the smith's warmth, until you realize he's sweating in the icy air, hammering away as if the fate of the kingdom depends on this horseshoe. And in a way it does. No horseshoes, no carts, no food. You glance next at the carpenters, shaping beams, repairing wagons, their sawdust freezing to the ground before it can even blow away. Their work is endless, because in a wooden city with thatched roofs, collapse was a constant threat, especially when snow piled heavy or rot crept in unseen. Historians still debate whether most urban repairs were organized by guilds or by desperate families themselves. But either way, the labor didn't stop just because the Seine had turned to slush. Street vendors shout nearby, selling wool mittens, iron nails, clay pots. A cobbler hunches over boots stiff with ice, muttering curses about wet leather, his all moving in stubborn rhythm. You can almost feel the ache in his back. And then there are the stonemasons, chiseling blocks destined for churches or bridges. Imagine swinging a chisel when your fingers are numb. It's basically medieval CrossFit, minus the trendy gym shorts. The guilds keep things running. Membership isn't just a badge of skill, it's survival. Guilds protect prices, guard secrets, and sometimes even provide charity for members struck by bad luck. But don't think of them as cuddly unions. You break their rules and you're out, no matter how many mouths you have to feed at home. Still, in this bitter winter, the sense of belonging keeps many afloat. You hear the clatter of tools, the shuffle of apprentices fetching wood, the laughter of journeymen trying to keep spirits alive with crude jokes. The cold presses in all the same. Tools slip in frozen hands, nails snap, wood cracks. And when daylight fades early, torches flicker over half-finished work, shadows stretching tall across the walls. A craftsman lifts his face, squinting, deciding whether to finish this plank tonight or risk losing tomorrow's bread. The line between exhaustion and determination grows thin, and you wonder how many stories of brilliance or ruin were forged here. In these bitter winters, as you leave the bustle, your footsteps carry you toward a broader sound, the steady toll of bells rolling across the rooftops. Their iron voices call from Notre Dame, echoing over the city, marking not just the hours but the heartbeat of Paris itself. The bells keep swinging, their deep voices rolling across rooftops like waves of iron. You tilt your head and listen, Notre Dame's towers booming first, then smaller churches answering back in overlapping echoes. Each clang feels like it sinks into your bones, a reminder that time belongs not to you but to the church. Even in winter's suffocating silence, those bells refuse to let the city forget its rhythm. You shuffle closer, past shivering beggars clustered at the cathedral doors, their hands stretched like withered branches toward anyone with a spare coin. Inside, candlelight shimmers against stained glass that barely catches the weak daylight. You smell wax, incense, and the faint must of damp stone. The chants rise, slow and steady, a sound that feels both soothing and oppressive, like someone wrapping you in a blanket that's a little too tight. Priests thunder from pulpits about sin, famine, and the dangers of losing faith in the cold. Their sermons describe hell with enough detail to make you sweat under your cloak. At the same time, there's comfort, the bread and wine of communion, the flickering glow of votive candles, the warmth of being in a space where everyone else is just as scared as you. Historians still debate whether medieval Parisians clung to faith, mostly out of devotion or out of fear. But it hardly matters. The church bells left no space for forgetting. Mystery plays sometimes break the gloom. A makeshift stage goes up in the square outside, actors in painted masks performing biblical stories. Devils with red horns prance, angels swing fake swords. Peasants laugh nervously at jokes that sound suspiciously like gossip about their neighbors. It's half theater, half sermon, and entirely unforgettable. Children tug at their mothers' sleeves, whispering that the devils look a little too real. Honestly, the costumes are basically early medieval cosplay, minus the Comic-Con merch tables. And yet beneath the ritual and spectacle, something more fragile flickers. People light candles not just for saints, but for lost parents, sick children, absent husbands. The bells may thunder about eternity, but the prayers whispered beneath them are small, trembling, human. You kneel for a moment on the cold stone, knees aching, and realize faith here is both shield and chain. As the service ends, the bells toll once more, driving their iron echoes across the frozen rooftops. You step back into the street, the air sharper now, the sky dimming toward twilight. Somewhere nearby, laughter rings out. Not pious or fearful, but mischievous. A festival is beginning, proof that even in the hardest winter, Parisians knew how to carve joy from ice. The laughter drifts you toward a splash of color in the gray streets, a festival blooming like a stubborn flower in frost. You spot painted banners swaying above a square, bonfires sparking against the dusk, and people huddled close, stamping their feet in rhythm to keep warm. For a moment, Paris forgets the hunger and cold, trading them for masks, music, and a dash of mischief. Jugglers toss torches into the night sky, their flames briefly brighter than the stars. Musicians crank hurdy-gurdies, scrape fiddles, and blow horns so loud, you swear they're competing with the cathedral bells. Children whirl in circles until they topple over laughing, while adults sip hot-spiced wine from wooden cups, cheeks flushed more from alcohol than warmth. You sidestep a pair of goats dressed in bells and ribbons. Honestly, medieval festivals were like a mashup between a circus, a street party, and a farmyard fashion show. This might be the Feast of Fools, where the world turns upside down. Peasants dress as kings, priests wear masks, and everyone pokes fun at authority. Laughter mixes with the smoke of roasting chestnuts, the smell thick and sweet in the air. A man in a fool's hood parades a donkey through the crowd, and when the animal brays, the crowd answers with mock prayers. Historians still debate whether these festivities were harmless fun or a dangerous crack in the wall of religious order. But for the frozen masses, it was a necessary rebellion. You feel yourself pulled into the rhythm, clapping in time with the drum, letting the wine's scent and the fire's warmth loosen your shoulders. For a few hours, the city remembers how to be light-hearted. There are jokes about miserly neighbors, playful songs about the bishop's waistline, and more than one dare involving dancing barefoot on the icy cobbles. You laugh in spite of yourself, realizing that humor might be Paris's secret weapon against despair. But as the fire dies lower and the last fiddle squeaks into silence, the cold creeps back in. People gather their cloaks. Children yawn, and the festival folds itself away until next winter. You linger a moment, watching sparks float upward, disappearing into the dark sky like tiny wishes. The city exhales, settling back into its struggle, but you carry the warmth of that shared laughter with you as you drift down the narrow streets once more. The memory of laughter still warms your chest when the sound of wheels creaking and hooves clopping on frozen cobbles drags your attention elsewhere. A procession winds its way through the streets, torches bobbing in the gloom like fireflies chained to sticks. This isn't a festival. This is a pilgrimage. One of those solemn marches meant to tug heaven's sleeve and beg for mercy. Men and women shuffle along, shoulders hunched against the wind, chanting hymns that rise like smoke into the brittle night air. Some carry wooden crosses so large, you wonder how their frostbitten fingers don't snap clean off. Others drag carts with relics, shards of bone said to belong to saints, locked in golden reliquaries that glitter like stubborn stars against the gloom. Children trail behind, half asleep, clutching their parents' cloaks. The rhythm is slow, steady, almost hypnotic, like the heartbeat of a city praying in unison. You can't help but think of how desperate it all looks, and yet how strangely comforting. For peasants who had nothing else, no doctors, no warm houses, no certainty, the idea that a saint's finger bone might tip God's balance toward kindness made the cold feel less cruel. Historians still argue whether these relics ever truly mattered, or if they were just medieval placebo. But what can't be denied is the hope etched on every frost-chapped face. Candles sputter in the wind, some dying out instantly, others clinging on like stubborn little fighters. A woman at your side mutters that each flame represents a soul, and you smirk softly, imagining how she'd react to a modern birthday cake. But here, every light feels sacred, every step an act of defiance against despair. As the line snakes past Notre Dame, its towers looming like frozen giants, the chanting deepens, echoing off stone walls until the air vibrates with it. You feel your chest tighten, not with fear but with the strange hush that falls when humans come together in shared longing. Even if the relics are bone fragments of somebody's dinner chicken, the faith that surrounds them feels real enough to warm the night. When the procession fades into the distance, you're left with the image of torches bobbing away into the dark, like tiny ships sailing on a black sea. The streets grow quiet again, the only sound your own breath puffing out like little clouds. And in the silence, the city reminds you that while faith can light the way, it doesn't change the frost under your boots. The torches flicker away into memory, but soon another kind of warmth calls you closer, the kitchen hearths of Paris. You step into a smoky tavern, ducking under a sagging beam, and immediately the air wraps around you like a heavy, greasy blanket. The smell of onions, garlic, and something vaguely resembling meat broth hangs thick enough to chew. Your nose wrinkles, but your stomach growls anyway. People are huddled around cauldrons where stews bubble slowly, each pot a gamble of ingredients, a turnip, a carrot, a splash of yesterday's ale, and if luck is on your side, a scrap of pork the size of a coin. You ladle a spoonful and the taste smacks your tongue, salty, smoky, oddly satisfying. Here it's not gourmet, but in a city where winter eats people alive, hot stew is survival disguised as dinner. You can almost laugh thinking how modern cooking shows would judge it. Lacks presentation, but hey, at least it won't kill you. Probably. Bread, though. Bread is king here. Loaves as hard as bricks, blackened by rye and barley, get dunked straight into the stew until soft enough not to crack a tooth. Kids gnaw at crusts like puppies, while old men guard the rare white loaves made with wheat, a luxury that practically glows against the gloom. And yes, historians still debate how much wheat reached Paris in the coldest months, but everyone agrees. When you had it, you guarded it like treasure. Around you, chatter buzzes. Someone swears by garlic cloves tucked under the tongue to keep out the frost, while another insists on boiling cabbage with vinegar to ward off plague. Folk remedies become culinary experiments, and half the time you can't tell if you're eating food or medicine. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone's taste buds survived, but in the crackle of the fire and the steam rising from battered wooden bowls, you feel something like contentment. The tavern glows with noisy warmth, laughter bouncing off the walls, even as the wind shrieks outside. People share benches, elbows pressed close, their cheeks flushed from wine that tastes suspiciously like vinegar. Yet they drink it anyway, because it's not just about taste. It's about forgetting the cold gnawing at your bones. You glance at the door, frost creeping along its edges, and realize the irony. The harsher the winter outside, the sweeter these small moments of heat and company feel. The stew might be thin, the bread stale, the wine sour, but together they form a feast worthy of kings, or at least of survivors. And you, tucked into the noise and smoke, know that for one night you're warm enough. The warmth of the tavern lingers in your memory, but when you step back into the streets of Paris, the cold slices sharper than any knife. Tonight you're not looking for food or wine. You're listening for music. And yes, even in the dead of winter, even with hunger gnawing and frost biting, Paris had its music. It wasn't the polished kind you'd hear in cathedrals or noble courts, but the rough, lively sounds that spilled from the city's alleys and bridges. Picture this: a fiddler with cracked fingers scraping out a tune, his bow patched with horsehair that's seen better days. Beside him, a boy bangs a drum made from a barrel lid, while a woman sings with a voice raspy from smoke and cold. It's not perfect harmony, but it's enough to make a weary crowd stomp their feet on the frozen cobblestones, as if stamping down the cold itself. A laugh bursts out, a hand claps in rhythm, and suddenly the night doesn't feel quite so endless. In noble halls, music was a different affair. Lutes plucking, harps humming, melodies drifting like warm air through stone chambers. Sometimes minstrels sang tales of love so lofty they'd make you roll your eyes if you weren't careful. But outside, in the streets, songs leaned toward the cheeky and the bawdy. Jokes slipped between verses, and everyone joined in the chorus. Think of it as the medieval version of karaoke night, except without neon lights, and definitely with fewer lyrics about heartbreak over pizza. Historians still debate how much of this music was improvised versus memorized, but it hardly matters when you're there in the crowd. The important part is the rhythm in your chest, the sense that even winter can't silence the human urge to celebrate. And yes, some musicians added a little flair. Bells jingling at their ankles, masks over their faces, even acrobatics thrown in between songs. Entertainment was currency, and performers had to hustle harder than street magicians today. As you huddle closer, breath clouding in the air, you realize the power of these sounds. They don't chase away hunger, but they make you forget it for a moment. They don't melt the frost, but they set your feet moving until blood warms your toes. And maybe, just maybe, that's why music thrived even in the darkest winters. It wasn't decoration, it was survival. You lean against a wall listening to a final note hang in the air, and notice how the laughter that follows feels louder than the cold wind. The city still shivers, but for now it hums with defiance, as if every plucked string and stomped foot were a reminder. Paris may freeze, but it will never be silent. The last note of the fiddler fades into the night, and as you wander deeper into the maze of streets, your ears catch another kind of sound. This time, not music, but stories. Paris in winter had its own theater, and it wasn't hidden away in velvet-draped halls. It was alive in the squares, in taverns, even on the steps of churches, where performers spun tales and made the frozen crowds forget their numb fingers for a while. Imagine a group gathering under a sputtering torch, faces half lit, half lost to the shadows. A storyteller with wild eyes and a patched cloak begins weaving a tale of knights who fought dragons or maidens who outwitted kings. He gestures so wildly that snowflakes scatter off his sleeves, and when he lowers his voice to a whisper, everyone leans in, holding their breath. You'd swear even the wind pauses to listen. Then, just as tension peaks, he delivers a punchline and laughter bursts through the frost like fire. It's the medieval version of binge-watching a fantasy series, except you don't get to skip the ads. You drop a coin in his hat, or he stops mid-sentence. In churches, drama took on a holier tone. Mystery plays brought biblical stories to life, with actors dressed in painted masks, angels with wooden wings, and demons whose costumes were just realistic enough to make children bury their faces in their mothers' skirts. These weren't quiet lessons. They were fire, brimstone, miracles, and spectacle, staged right where you prayed. You can almost picture the contrast. Snow drifting outside while inside a mock hellmouth belches smoke and sparks, swallowing actors whole. Honestly, Netflix still hasn't topped that for production value. And then there were the jesters and fools, faces painted, bells jingling, jokes tumbling faster than the crowd could groan. Some were harmless slapstick, others bit dangerously close to politics, mocking nobles or priests with a wink that could either win roars of laughter or earn a night in the stocks. The line between comedy and punishment was razor thin, but hey, isn't that the fun of live entertainment? Historians still debate whether these plays and stories were meant more to teach morality or to distract from misery. Probably both. After all, what better way to remind people to fear sin than to stage it with smoke masks and a few awkward angels on stilts? But for the crowd, frozen to the bone and clutching each other for warmth, it was about escape. For an hour or two, you weren't a shivering peasant or a weary worker. You were swept into another world where demons lost. Heroes triumphed and laughter thawed the cold. As you step away, the sound of applause still echoing behind you, you realize that Paris in winter wasn't silent despair. It was theater stitched into the very bones of the city. And just as the fire of one torch dies, another stage lights up in the dark, promising yet another tale to carry you through the night. The echo of applause fades as you drift toward the edges of the city, where the grand voices of theater give way to quieter, stranger sounds. Winter in Paris wasn't just about hunger or performance. It was also a season of whispers, when shadows seemed to grow personalities of their own, and stories of the supernatural took root in icy soil. You pass an old stone wall, its cracks filled with frozen moss, and someone beside you swears they just saw a flicker of light dart across the courtyard. "Her will-o'-the-wisp," they mutter, crossing themselves quickly. These ghostly flames, said to lead travelers astray, glowed brightest on long, cold nights when the mist clung to the ground like a second skin. Scientists today might talk about swamp gas, but try explaining that to a medieval villager, trudging home through a fog so thick you can't see your own boots. To them it was simple. Follow that light and you might end up in a ditch, or worse, never come back at all. Then come the tales of restless spirits. Picture a narrow alley, silent except for the crunch of snow underfoot. Suddenly a shape drifts into view, a pale figure in a shroud, silent, unmoving. People swore the souls of the unburied wandered Paris, rattling doors, knocking softly on windows, to remind the living of their unfinished business. Historians still debate whether these stories sprang from superstition or were tools of social order, reminders to pay for proper burials and keep the church coffers heavy. Either way, the effect was the same. When the wind scraped against your shutters at midnight, you pulled the blankets tighter and whispered a prayer. And of course, no medieval winter would be complete without a demon or two. The cold made people imagine every draught as a claw, every creak as a hoof. Preachers warned that winter nights were the devil's favorite hunting ground, when despair and hunger made souls easy to catch. Some villagers told of black dogs prowling the streets, eyes glowing like embers, leaving no paw prints in the snow. You can almost hear it. A low growl that makes your breath fog faster, your steps quicker, your heart pound like a drum in your chest. Here's a fun twist. Sometimes these hauntings weren't just scary, they were convenient. Blame a ghost for stolen bread. Problem solved. Blame a demon for your bad luck. Suddenly you're off the hook. Fear made a handy scapegoat, and superstition doubled as medieval crisis management. So as you wrap your cloak tighter and hurry past another crooked alley, you realize Paris in winter was as much haunted by imagination as by hunger. Shadows stretched longer, stories traveled faster, and every flicker of torchlight seemed to hide something waiting to leap. Whether real or not, the legends gave shape to fear, and maybe, just maybe, they made the cold nights a little less empty. You push forward, leaving behind the haunted alleys, and the city slowly breathes again, but not with warmth. Instead, it hums with survival tricks, the kind only winter could teach. You notice the small, quiet inventions that kept Parisians going, improvised hacks that feel almost like life hacks of their day, though none of them would make it onto a cozy YouTube reel. Take fuel, for example. Wood was scarce and expensive, so households stretched it as far as possible. People mixed sawdust, straw, and even dried dung to form little bricks of fire fuel. Imagine tossing that onto the hearth. It doesn't sound glamorous, but when the frost bites through your boots, you'll be grateful for the stink. Historians still debate whether such substitutes were widespread or more of a desperate last resort, but the smell alone would make you believe no one did it willingly. Then there was food storage. The cold was brutal, but it doubled as a natural refrigerator. Meat hung from rafters, preserved by icy drafts. Barrels of salted fish and pickled vegetables lined cellars, guarded like treasure. Sometimes people tucked root vegetables under layers of straw in outdoor pits, pulling them out weeks later, like a prize from nature's freezer. And sure, the potatoes hadn't arrived yet in medieval Europe, but turnips were basically the potato's cranky cousin, filling, reliable, and almost impossible to romanticize. Even clothing became a form of innovation. Layer upon layer of wool, fur linings stitched into hoods, mittens made from scraps. Children wore the hand-me-downs of older siblings, patched so many times they looked like quilts in motion. The trick was to trap air between fabrics, primitive insulation that worked surprisingly well, unless the dampness of the Seine seeped in, making everything heavy and clammy. Picture yourself trying to sleep in 3 tunics, 2 pairs of hose and a cloak, only to wake up feeling like you've wrestled a bear in your dreams. And then there were community hacks. Neighbors shared ovens, using one great fire to bake loaves for several families at once. Entire streets sometimes pooled resources for stew pots, each tossing in what little they could spare. The result wasn't gourmet, but it was survival by committee. You can almost smell the broth simmering, a chaotic mix of onions, cabbage, maybe a scrap of pork if someone was lucky. One of the stranger solutions came in the form of warming stones, small rocks heated by fire, then wrapped in cloth and tucked under blankets. Essentially medieval hot water bottles without the water. The problem? Forgetting one in the fire too long. More than one family learned the hard way that rolling a glowing stone into bed was less cozy and more goodbye linens. These tricks were small, but they mattered. Each one chipped away at the cold's dominion, proving that human stubbornness could outmatch even the harshest winter. And as you step through this frozen Paris, you realize survival wasn't just about big victories, but about little sparks, scraps of warmth, bites of food, the ingenuity that refused to let winter win. The city grows quieter as you slip deeper into its frozen heart, and now the winter seems to pull shadows from the ground itself. Paris in the cold months wasn't just a place of hunger and smoke. It was a stage for stories that walked on the edge of fear. Every corner seemed to sprout a tale, whispered by firelight or muttered in the market stalls. You hear of wolves, for one, not just the metaphorical kind, but real ones, bold enough to creep into the outskirts of Paris during especially harsh winters. When hunger pressed too hard, they prowled close to the walls, their howls sliding over the city like icy fingers. Chroniclers tell of wolf packs darting through gates left open too long, scattering chickens and terror alike. Imagine being told to fetch water in the twilight and suddenly spotting eyes glowing back at you from the snow. Historians still debate whether such encounters were exaggerated by fear, but honestly, one wolf in your backyard feels like too many regardless. And then there were the ghost stories. The cold bred silence, and silence bred imagination. People swore that spirits walked the bridges at night, the souls of drowned beggars rising with the mist from the Seine. Others claimed phantom monks haunted abandoned chapels, whispering prayers that froze the marrow. Children huddled under blankets while their parents murmured warnings, behave, or the restless dead might knock on your door before dawn. You laugh at the thought, but then again, haven't you felt that odd shiver in the dark when the wind sighs just wrong? Not all tales were terrifying. Some were almost comforting in their strangeness, like the one of Saint Genevieve's invisible cloak, said to shield the city from the worst of winter storms, or the legend of a mysterious baker who appeared only on the coldest nights, leaving loaves on doorsteps before vanishing into the fog. Were these miracles, metaphors, or just wishful thinking? Hard to say. But for people shivering on empty stomachs, hope was sometimes the warmest thing on offer. The Seine itself became a canvas for superstition. When it froze solid, people said the river spirits had fallen asleep, and walking on its surface was like stepping across their backs. You picture it, villagers creeping across the ice, half thrilled, half terrified, listening for the groan of water beneath. To them, every crack wasn't just danger. It was a warning from whatever lived below. These legends stitched themselves into daily life, blurring the line between survival and imagination. Werewolves, ghosts, saints, demons, they weren't entertainment. They were explanations, a way to shape the chaos of winter into stories that gave it meaning. And as you walk beneath the frost-stiffened roofs, you realize something funny. In a city of stone, wood, and snow, stories were the insulation people relied on most. Because while a fire could warm your hands, a tale whispered, believed, half-feared, could keep the cold from ever reaching your soul. The stories swirl around you like snowflakes, but the night grows deeper still, and you notice the weight of the stars pressing down. In a city half asleep and half frozen, people didn't just glance at the heavens for comfort. They scanned them for signs, desperate to know whether the cold would lift or tighten its grip. Picture yourself standing in a dark square, bundled in whatever scraps of wool you can find, eyes lifted to the sky. A streak of light, just a comet, tears across the frozen heavens and suddenly whispers break out. Famine, plague, war. It's like a medieval version of doom scrolling, only the headlines are written in fire. Historians still debate whether such celestial interpretations were widely believed or just convenient sermon fodder for priests. But one thing is certain. In a season when the earth gave no answers, people turned upward for explanations. Eclipses were worse. Imagine the weak winter sun struggling to shine, only to be swallowed entirely in midday shadow. Chickens confused, dogs howling, children crying, panic spreading faster than the darkness itself. Some claimed it was God's warning. Others swore dragons were devouring the sun. You might laugh, but remember how unsettling it feels even today when the light turns wrong. Like the world has slipped off its track. And then there were the auroras, rare, but when they did appear, they shook imaginations loose. Ribbons of red flickering in the northern sky were said to be ghostly armies. Spectral battles fought in the heavens, while the living shivered below. Peasants crossed themselves, priests thundered about Judgment Day, and even the most skeptical nobles peeked nervously from castle windows. To see lights dance across the frozen horizon was both a gift and a curse, too beautiful to dismiss, too terrifying to embrace. Of course, some people found ways to laugh at it all. A candlemaker joked that comets were just the saints dropping sparks while working late. A weary farmer muttered that if dragons truly ate the sun, at least they'd be warm. These small jokes didn't erase the fear, but they carved out little pockets of relief, like finding an extra crust of bread when you thought the basket was empty. You feel the cold pressing closer, the silence heavy after the tales of heavenly omens. The winter sky above Paris wasn't just decoration. It was a stage where people projected their deepest anxieties, their wildest hopes, their fragile faith. And every flicker of light, every shadow, carried the weight of survival. Because when the earth is frozen, the rivers hard, and the streets silent, the only place left to search for meaning is the sky itself. The sky above you holds its silence, and at last the long night of stories begins to ease. You feel the weight of all those winters, the hunger, the frostbite, the whispers of ghosts and comets, settling into a quiet hush, like snow drifting over old footprints. The streets of Paris fade into something softer now, their icy stones no longer biting at your souls, but slipping away into memory. Your breath slows, and the details of the world blur. You still hear the faint echoes, a cough behind a shuttered door, the scrape of a shovel on frozen ground, the distant creak of a cart's wheels in the frost. Yet each sound seems farther away, gentler, as though wrapped in wool and laid aside for the night. Historians might argue about how people endured those winters, whether through faith, superstition, or sheer stubbornness. But in this moment, what lingers is not the hardship itself, but the endurance, a kind of fragile strength stitched into every story. You imagine the people of medieval Paris, huddled together, laughing when they could, sharing scraps, lighting candles against the dark. They carried on through winters that might have broken them, their hopes as fragile as icicles, yet shining just the same. You feel the softness of that resilience now, flowing into your own breathing, reminding you that even in the harshest seasons, people found ways to dream of spring. The fire in your mind's eye burns lower, the shadows stretch longer, and your body sinks heavier into rest. Each word fades like a snowflake melting on your skin, cold at first, then gone, leaving only stillness. You are no longer walking the frozen streets. You are drifting, floating, carried on the same quiet current that has borne countless souls into sleep before you. So let the chill recede. Let the voices soften. Let the stories fold themselves into silence. And as you close your eyes, imagine Paris wrapped in snow, the towers hushed, the river still, the sky calm at last. You are safe, warm, and at peace. End of script. Sweet dreams.